The Steel Coffin and the Rising Sun. The year was 1941, and the Pacific Ocean had become a vast blue graveyard. Following the devastation at Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy was crippled, its battleship row a twisted mass of scorched metal. The American public was reeling, gripped by a fear that the West Coast was next. In those dark early months, the only force capable of carrying the fight to the enemy's front door was the Submarine Force, a group of volunteers known as the Silent Service. Life aboard a fleet submarine was a claustrophobic test of the human spirit. Imagine 70 men crammed into a pressurized steel tube no wider than a hallway, surrounded by high-voltage batteries, volatile fuel, and high-explosive torpedoes. The air was a thick soup of diesel fumes, sweat, and unwashed bodies. There were no windows, no sunlight, and for months at a time, the only connection to the world above was the ghostly ping of the sonar or the cold eye of the periscope. To the men of the Silent Service, the submarine was both a weapon and a potential tomb. If they were spotted, they faced the terrifying depth charge, heavy canisters of TNT dropped by Japanese destroyers designed to crush the hull like a soda can. Yet these sailors accepted the 25% casualty rate, the highest of any branch in the U.S. military, because they knew the war could not be won without them. They were the invisible hunters, tasked with a singular, brutal mission: cut the veins of the Japanese Empire by sinking every ship that flew the Rising Sun flag. The Predator of Wewak, USS Wahoo, SS-238. By 1943, the USS Wahoo was a boat in search of a soul. Early in the war, American skippers were trained to be cautious, firing from great distances and diving at the first sign of trouble. But Mush Morton was a different breed of sailor. When he stepped onto the bridge, he brought a cigar-chomping, fire-breathing aggression that terrified his enemies and inspired his crew. He didn't want to hide, he wanted to hunt. Morton's philosophy was simple. The submarine was a surface ship that just happened to be able to dive. He moved the executive officer, Richard O'Kane, to the periscope so Morton could focus on the big picture of the battle. This division of labor made Wahoo the most efficient killing machine in the Pacific. The crew felt the change instantly. The boat no longer felt like a hiding place, but a sharpened spear. The legend was cemented at Wewak, a Japanese stronghold in New Guinea. The harbor was a labyrinth of reefs and mines, uncharted by the U.S. Navy. Most skippers would have stayed miles away, but Morton saw an opportunity. Using a cheap map he'd bought in a grocery store back in the States, he guided the Wahoo into the shallows. The crew held their breath as the hull scraped near the bottom, the sound of the reef like fingernails on a chalkboard. Inside the harbor sat a Japanese destroyer, the Harusame. In the world of naval warfare, a destroyer is a submarine's natural predator. Instead of turning tail, Morton ordered the Wahoo to steer directly at the enemy. He waited until the destroyer was charging at them, foam flying from its bow, and then he gave the order, "Fire 1." It was a down-the-throat shot, the most dangerous maneuver in the manual. The torpedo struck with a roar that shook the Wahoo to its rivets. The destroyer didn't just sink, it disintegrated. Morton stayed on the surface, patrolling the harbor and sinking 3 more transport ships before slipping back out into the deep. When the Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor, Morton had a broom lashed to the periscope, a traditional sign of a clean sweep. The Wahoo had proven that the Japanese were not invincible. They were vulnerable even in their own homes. Morton had taught the Navy how to fight, but the cost of such aggression was high. Eventually, the Wahoo would fail to return from a patrol in the Sea of Japan, leaving behind a legacy that redefined American naval doctrine forever. The Ace of the Deep, USS Tang, SS-306. Richard O'Kane had learned everything he knew from Morton on the Wahoo, but when he took command of the USS Tang, he perfected the art. O'Kane was a technician of death. He calculated torpedo spreads with the precision of a mathematician and maneuvered his boat with the grace of a dancer. Under his command, the Tang would become the highest-scoring submarine in American history, a gray ghost that haunted the Formosa Strait. The Tang's fifth patrol is the stuff of naval nightmares. O'Kane encountered a massive convoy of Japanese tankers and freighters guarded by aggressive escort ships. Rather than attacking from a distance, O'Kane did the unthinkable. He surfaced the Tang in the middle of the convoy. In the dark of night, the submarine was nearly invisible, while the massive merchant ships were silhouettes against the horizon. It was a chaotic melee. O'Kane stood on the bridge, shouting orders as the Tang darted between the giant ships. At one point, he was so close to a Japanese freighter that he could hear the enemy sailors shouting on deck. He fired torpedoes in every direction, sinking 2 ships in minutes. The Japanese escorts began firing blindly into the dark, actually hitting their own ships because they couldn't believe an American sub was right in their midst. The Tang was an unstoppable force, but fate has a cruel way of balancing the scales. On her final night of action, after sinking multiple targets, O'Kane ordered the firing of the boat's last torpedo. It was a Mark 18 electric torpedo. As the crew watched, the wake didn't move toward the enemy. It began to curve. The torpedo was malfunctioning, circling back in a wide arc toward the very boat that had birthed it. O'Kane screamed for emergency speed, trying to outrun his own weapon, but it was too late. The torpedo struck the Tang's stern with a deafening blast. The boat began to sink instantly, dragging men down into the dark. O'Kane and a few others were blown off the bridge into the freezing water. Below them, men trapped in the forward torpedo room staged a heroic escape using Momsen lungs, the only time such a device was successfully used in combat during the war. O'Kane survived the night, only to be picked up by a Japanese frigate the next morning. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, beaten and starved, but his spirit remained unbroken. He was eventually awarded the Medal of Honor, and the Tang remains a symbol of both the incredible skill and the terrifying unpredictability of submarine warfare. The Secret Giant, USS Archerfish, SS-311. In late 1944, the USS Archerfish was assigned what many sailors considered a boring mission, lifeguard duty. Their job was to sit off the coast of Japan and wait to rescue downed B-29 pilots. Commander Joseph Enright was frustrated. He wanted a kill. He had no idea that he was about to stumble upon the greatest prize of the entire Pacific War. On a moonlit night in November, the Archerfish radar operator picked up a massive blip. Enright assumed it was an island until he realized the island was moving at 20 knots. It was the Shinano, a secret Japanese supercarrier. Converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, it was a steel fortress, the largest aircraft carrier ever built. It was on its maiden voyage, moving from one port to another to finish its construction. For 6 grueling hours, Enright chased the giant. The Archerfish was slower than the Shinano, and Enright feared he would lose her in the dark. He pushed his diesel engines to the breaking point, the cylinders thumping so hard the entire boat vibrated. He sent a radio signal to Pearl Harbor, but they didn't believe him. They told him there were no carriers of that size in the area. Enright ignored them and kept his eyes on the mountain on the horizon. Then the Shinano made a fatal mistake. Fearing American wolf packs, the Japanese captain ordered a zigzag maneuver. This turn brought the carrier directly into the path of the Archerfish. Enright didn't hesitate. He set his torpedoes for a shallow depth to ensure they hit the vulnerable hull above the armor belt. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. 6 torpedoes raced through the water. 4 hits. The explosions were so massive they nearly knocked the Archerfish out of the water. Enright dived deep to escape the inevitable depth charge retaliation, listening through the sonar as the great ship began to groan. The Shinano's crew, inexperienced and overwhelmed, couldn't stop the flooding. Hours later, the secret pride of the Japanese Navy capsized and slid beneath the waves, taking hundreds of sailors with it. When Enright returned to port, he was initially met with skepticism. It was only after the war, when Japanese records were seized, that the Navy realized the Archerfish had sunk a 72,000-ton behemoth. A single submarine had destroyed a ship that could have changed the course of the air war over Japan. It remains the largest ship ever sunk by a submarine in the history of naval combat. The commando sub, USS Barb SS-220. By 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet was almost non-existent. The silent service had done its job too well. Commander Eugene Fluckey, the captain of the USS Barb, was bored with traditional targets. He was a man of boundless imagination and lucky by name and nature. He decided that if there were no more ships to sink, he would bring the war to the Japanese mainland itself. Fluckey began by modifying the Barb. He convinced the Navy to let him install a rocket launcher on the deck, the first of its kind. He used it to bombard Japanese factories and shore installations, watching from the bridge as rockets lit up the night sky like the 4th of July. But his most audacious plan involved a target that didn't even float, the Japanese National Railway. While patrolling off the coast of Katafuto, Fluckey watched through his periscope as trains moved supplies along the coast. He called for volunteers for a ground mission. 8 men, including a former Boy Scout who knew how to plant explosives, paddled ashore in rubber boats. It was a suicide mission. If they were caught, the Barb would have to leave them behind to save the boat. The men worked in total silence, stumbling through the dark and hiding in the brush when Japanese patrols passed by. They reached the tracks and planted a massive scuttling charge, rigging it with a pressure switch so the train itself would trigger the explosion. As they scrambled back to their boats and began the long paddle back to the Barb, the whistle of a steam engine echoed through the hills. The explosion was a spectacular pillar of fire. The locomotive was tossed into the air like a toy, and 16 cars crumpled behind it. On the bridge of the Barb, Fluckey watched the fireworks and cheered. He had just led the only ground invasion of the Japanese home islands by American forces during the war. The USS Barb finished the war with one of the most decorated records in history. Her battle flag was a mosaic of sunk ships, but right in the corner was a tiny embroidered locomotive. Fluckey's creativity and daring proved that the American submarine was more than just a boat. It was a versatile tool of psychological and physical warfare that knew no limits. The immortal USS Silversides SS-236. The USS Silversides was not a boat of firsts or biggests. It was a boat of survival. She conducted 14 combat patrols and survived some of the most brutal depth chargings of the war. To the men who served on her, the Silversides was a living entity that refused to die. Her story is the story of the average submariner, the grueling tension, the sudden violence, and the strange human moments in between. During one patrol, the Silversides was stalking a convoy when a Japanese plane spotted her. The boat crash-dived, but a depth charge exploded so close that it blew the lights out and sent the boat into a steep plane. Water began spraying from broken valves. The crew worked in the dark, using flashlights to find the leaks while the hull groaned under the pressure. This was the daily reality, a constant dance with a crushing death. The most famous story of the Silversides occurred not in battle, but on the wardroom table. A young sailor, George Platter, was dying of a burst appendix. There was no doctor, only a pharmacist's mate named Thomas Moore. With the boat submerged and the air getting thin, Moore performed a 2-hour surgery using a kitchen knife and spoons for tools. He used ether for anesthesia, despite the risk that a single spark could blow the boat up. While Platter lay open on the table, the Silversides was forced to dive again to avoid an enemy destroyer. The boat tilted, and Moore had to be held steady by other sailors so he wouldn't slip. Against every medical probability, the surgery was a success. It became a symbol of the resourcefulness of the silent service, men who did the impossible because they had no other choice. The Silversides went on to sink 23 ships, ranking her third among all U.S. submarines for total ships sunk. She was a workhorse, a boat that took everything the Japanese Navy could throw at her and kept coming back for more. Her engines never failed, and her crew never wavered, even when the ocean floor was littered with the wrecks of their sister ships. Today, the Silversides rests in Muskegon, Michigan. She is one of the few surviving fleet boats of World War II. When you walk her decks, you can still smell the faint scent of diesel and oil. She stands as a monument to the 3,500 American submariners who never came home, a silent witness to a war fought in the shadows of the deep. The Ghost of the Palawan Passage, USS Darter, SS-227. By October 1944, the Pacific War was reaching its crescendo. The Japanese Navy was preparing for a final, desperate stand at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They unleashed their center force, a massive fleet led by the two largest battleships ever built, the Yamato and the Musashi. But before they could reach the American landing beaches, they had to pass through the narrow Palawan Passage. Waiting in the shadows were the USS Darter and her sister ship, the Dace. Commander David McClintock of the Darter knew this was the moment every submariner dreamed of. Through the periscope, he saw a forest of masts on the horizon, a line of heavy cruisers and battleships that stretched for miles. This wasn't just a convoy, it was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Darter and Dace coordinated their attack in the pre-dawn darkness, moving like wolves on the edge of a herd. The Darter took aim at the flagship of the entire fleet, the heavy cruiser Otago. McClintock fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 5 of them slammed into the Otago, tearing the massive ship apart so quickly that the Japanese admiral was forced to swim for his life. Without pausing, McClintock swung the Darter around and fired her stern tubes at another cruiser, the Takao, leaving it dead in the water and burning. The chaos was total. The Japanese fleet, thinking they were surrounded by a massive task force, began firing wildly. But the Darter's luck was about to run out. In the heat of the pursuit through the treacherous shallow waters, the submarine slammed into a hidden reef at 17 knots. The sound of tearing metal screamed through the boat as she was lifted out of the water, grounded firmly on the coral. The crew was stranded in the middle of an enemy-controlled sea, with the Japanese fleet they had just crippled looming nearby. McClintock ordered the secret documents destroyed and the crew to evacuate to the Dace. They tried to scuttle the Darter with torpedoes and deck guns so the Japanese couldn't capture her technology, but the stubborn boat refused to sink, remaining perched on the reef as a permanent monument to the ambush. Though the Darter was lost, her sacrifice changed the course of the war. She had alerted the U.S. Pacific Fleet to the Japanese approach and removed 3 heavy cruisers from the battle before it even began. The Ghost of Palawan had struck a blow that echoed all the way to the end of the war, proving that even a grounded sub could win a fleet engagement. The final sting, USS Trigger SS-237. The USS Trigger was a boat that seemed to possess a personality of its own, tenacious, lucky, and incredibly deadly. She was one of the most decorated vessels in the fleet, known for her down-the-throat aggression and her ability to sniff out Japanese shipping where others found only empty ocean. But by 1945, the waters around Japan had become a graveyard of mines and elite anti-submarine hunter-killer groups. The Trigger was commanded by Commander David Knoll, a man who pushed the boat to its absolute limits. During one of her most famous engagements, the Trigger found herself surrounded by a Japanese convoy, escorted by multiple destroyers. Instead of diving deep in silent running, Knoll used the Trigger's speed to surface and submerge repeatedly, popping up like a jack-in-the-box to fire, and then vanishing before the enemy could range their guns. The battle lasted for hours. The Trigger took out several freighters, but the Japanese destroyers were closing in. The crew could hear the ping of the enemy sonar getting louder and sharper, the sound of a hunter who has finally cornered its prey. The Trigger was forced into a deep dive, exceeding her test depth as the hull groaned and rivets began to pop like champagne corks under the immense pressure of the Pacific. Despite the damage, the Trigger fought back from the depths. She managed to sink one of the pursuing escorts with a sophisticated acoustic torpedo, a homing weapon that sought out the sound of the destroyer's propellers. It was a high-tech duel beneath the waves, a precursor to the modern submarine warfare of the Cold War. However, the Trigger story is one of ultimate sacrifice. In March 1945, while patrolling near Okinawa, the Trigger was detected by a combined force of Japanese aircraft and ships. For over 2 hours, she was subjected to a relentless depth charge attack. Other American submarines in the area reported hearing a series of heavy explosions, followed by an eerie, metallic silence. The Trigger never returned to port. She was lost with all hands, joining the Eternal Patrol just months before the war ended. Her legacy, however, was secure. She had sunk over 180,000 tons of enemy shipping. The Trigger reminded the world that the Silent Service fought until the very last second, ensuring that the path to victory was paved by the bravest men to ever wear the dolphins. By August 1945, the Japanese Empire was a hollow shell. Its factories were silent for lack of fuel, and its people were starving because no food could reach the islands. While the atomic bombs ended the war, it was the U.S. submarine force that had already won it by strangling the enemy's economy. They had sunk over 5 million tons of shipping, a feat that remains unparalleled in naval history. But the victory came at a staggering cost. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. Each overdue and presumed lost message sent a ripple of grief through the tight-knit submarine community. These men didn't have funerals, they had eternal patrols. They vanished into the blue, leaving behind only letters and the memories of their courage. The legacy of Morton, O'Kane, Enright, Fluckey, and the crew of the Silversides is etched into the freedom of the Pacific. They were the men who fought a lonely war, far from the cameras and the glory. They lived by a code of silence, but their impact was heard in every explosion that rocked the Japanese coast. They proved that even in the darkest depths, the human spirit can find a way to shine. The echoes of the diesel engines may have faded into history, and the hulls of these great hunters may now be silent, but their stories only live on through people like you. The Silent Service earned its name because their missions were top secret, whispered in the corridors of power, and buried in the logs of the deep. But today, we have the privilege of bringing those stories to the surface. If you felt the tension of the Wahoo's down-the-throat shot or the heartbreak of the Tang's final circle, we invite you to join our crew. By subscribing to this channel, you're ensuring that the bravery of these sailors is never forgotten and that more of history's greatest chapters are brought to light. Every like you give acts like a signal flare, helping other history enthusiasts find these narratives in the vast ocean of the Internet. And we want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us, which of these skippers' gambles do you think was the gutsiest? Or is there a legendary submarine we haven't covered yet that deserves its own chapter? Your support keeps this mission cruising at full speed. Thank you for diving deep with us today.